Last week, during an appearance on a right-wing podcast, U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent raised eyebrows when he seemed to throw his weight behind the idea of Alberta, a province in Canada, seceding from the rest of the country. Speaking to the podcast host, Bessent said he'd heard rumors that they may have a referendum on whether they want to stay in Canada or not, and described Alberta as, quote, a natural partner for the United States. But while Bessent is almost definitely the most high-profile official in the Trump administration to muse about Alberta separatism, it's a pretty popular talking point in MAGA more widely. Trump's former chief strategist, Steve Bannon, for instance, has talked about it quite a few times on his show. And last week, Republican Congressman Andy Ogles claimed that the people of Alberta would, quote, prefer to be part of the U.S. because we are winning. Earlier this week, the Financial Times even reported that the Trump administration had held a number of secret meetings within Alberta. Separatist group called the Alberta Prosperity Project, who are apparently seeking a $500 billion credit facility to help bankroll the province if they win an independence referendum. So, in this video, we're going to take a look at the history of Alberta separatism, why the Trump administration is apparently taking an interest, and whether it could actually happen. Hint: the answer is probably no. So let's start with a bit of context, because Alberta separatism actually has quite a long history. Arguably, the first push for separatism came way back in the 1930s during the Great Depression. While Alberta is today quite a rich province, thanks largely to its booming oil industry, back then it was pretty poor with a mostly agrarian economy. Canada was hit hard by the Great Depression, but things were particularly tough in rural provinces like Alberta, both because it arrived at the same time as an acute drought that crippled agricultural output, but also because global trade collapsed with the Depression, and Canada's western provinces had previously relied heavily on exports. By the early 30s, something like 2/3 of the population in these provinces were unemployed, but the federal government refused to provide meaningful financial aid with both Conservative Prime Minister R.B. Bennett and his Liberal successor W.L. Mackenzie King arguing that welfare was essentially a provincial responsibility. This didn't go down well in Alberta and led to the creation of the Alberta Social Credit Party, who after being elected in 1935 basically tried to alleviate the impact of the Depression by creating a new form of money to go alongside the Canadian dollar. The federal government didn't like this parallel currency, and as tensions grew, some social credit politicians started pushing for secession. Astonishingly then, Prime Minister W.L. Mackenzie King didn't even seem that fussed by the idea, saying at one point, quote, Alberta is part of the U.S. desert area. I doubt if it will be of any real use again. Nonetheless, the leader of the Social Credit Party, William Aberhart, thought secession was a step too far. Tensions between the provincial and federal governments persisted throughout the mid-19th century, largely because Alberta, which is pretty rural, was and is more right-wing than the rest of Canada. You can see this in their voting history. The Social Credit Party, which morphed into the bog-standard right-wing party after the Great Depression, held power from 1935 to 1971, and were then succeeded by the center-right Progressive Conservatives, who held office continuously from 1971 to 2015, the longest unbroken run in government in Canadian history. Conversely, however, the rest of Canada is pretty left-wing, which means that they often elect more left-wing governments at the federal level. With the Liberal Party holding power for most of Canada's post-war history, nonetheless, even if more conservative Albertans found this state of affairs irritating, secession only really became a talking point in the 70s. This was both because the federal government, then led by Pierre Trudeau, was considered unduly left-wing by many Albertan conservatives, but it was also because of the rising price of oil, with global prices skyrocketing from $3 a barrel in 1972 around $40 a barrel in 1980, largely thanks to the Arab oil embargo in 1973, and then the Iranian Revolution in 1979. This was obviously great news for Alberta's oil industry, which had really taken off in the late 40s and early 50s. Alberta's oil boom turned the province into a net contributor at the federal level. In other words, it paid more in taxes than it received in federal money. But things really kicked off when the federal government took steps to assert more control over Alberta's oil resources, including via the 1918 National Energy Program, which imposed price controls on Canadian oil and tried to nationalize parts of Alberta's oil industry. This is probably when support for separatism peaked. A 1981 poll by the Canada West Foundation found that 49% of Albertans agreed with the statement that Western Canadians get so few benefits from being part of Canada that they might as well go it on their own. But things calmed down when Trudeau was ousted by the Conservatives in 1984. That was until his son Justin Trudeau became Prime Minister in 2015. Many conservative Albertans saw Trudeau as unpalatably left-wing and argued that his environmental regulations unfairly disadvantaged Alberta's oil and gas industry. They got truly fed up when the Liberals, with the help of Donald Trump and his talk of annexing Canada, won a fourth consecutive term last year, overturning a 20-point deficit in the polls to beat Pierre Poilievre's Conservatives. Right-wing Albertan separatist Julie started pushing for an independence referendum, which would require them to collect at least 178,000 signatures, or 10% of eligible voters before May. This has apparently drawn the attention of the Trump administration, both because, well, A, presumably see Alberta separatism as a potential stepping stone to turning Canada into the 51st state, but also because Alberta is rich in natural resources, not just oil and gas, but also stuff like rare earths, which the Trump administration is very keen on. So could it actually happen? Could Alberta secede? Well, to be honest, no. Almost definitely not. Even if the separatists get the signatures, which is possible, polling suggests only 20 to 30% of Albertans support secession. And this number will almost definitely fall once the idea of secession becomes associated with Trump or Alberta becoming part of the U.S. Even if they did win under the Clarity Act, the federal government would then have to determine whether the referendum was really fair. And if the Trump administration was actively meddling in it, they could plausibly say it wasn't. Furthermore, anti-cession advocates are now petitioning for another separate referendum, asking Albertans to reaffirm their support for Canada's territorial integrity, which could complicate things further. All in all, the chances of Alberta actually seceding seem pretty close to zero. It's likely that, much like his previous attempts to interfere in other counts' domestic politics, Trump's meddling will hurt, not help.